Hey everyone, welcome back. So we had just gone over a lot of the concepts for setting up cameras and how you can do that in the room editor, and in this tutorial we're going to set up the camera's following of the object programmatically. So we're going to come back to the game room and back into viewports and cameras, and we are going to set this back to none, so there's not going to do object following via the room editor. We will leave everything else though, but we only set up the start and the game room, so we have to make sure that we set up the camera in the game over and the win as well. So come into viewports and cameras, tick enable viewports and visible. And we'll set the camera to 500 by 500 and do the same here. So tick enable viewports, visible, 500 by 500. We don't have to set up the viewport again, remember, because we already set that in the start room and the viewport is only sized once at the start. Alright. So now we are actually going to create a new object called OBJCamera. And this is going to be the controller object that sets up all of the camera variables and follows the player. So I'm going to make this a persistent object. It's going to be created in the room start, so let's do that before we forget. Drag it in here, just like the game object. There's only going to be one of these in the game, and because it's persistent now, it's going to carry through to the rest of the rooms, so we don't have to put it in all of them. Alright, so now, the first thing we're going to do is just set up a few variables for the camera. And this will include an X and Y position that we can update and then use to move the camera around. And we're also going to set a couple other ones. So all in all, we're going to set 5. So the first one, like I said, is going to be camera X and camera Y. And we'll leave those as 0 and 0 initially. And the next one is going to be target. So I'm going to use target instead of just explicitly saying OBJ ship, because maybe in the future we actually want something else to be the target of the camera. Maybe we can get it to follow, I don't know, an asteroid or an enemy ship for a cutscene or something like that. So we're going to set a target, and then target is going to equal OBJ ship, but we could change that in the future. And next is the camera width, which will be 500, and camera height. And the reason I'm setting these here is just because we're going to be referring to them quite a lot, and I want one place where I'm setting them. Alright, so that's the camera variables all set up. Now let's do the object following. So we're going to come into the step event, of course, because we need the camera to be updating every single frame. And first of all, we're going to just set these variables. Now remember, these aren't actually built-in variables at all. They don't actually control the camera, they're just variables that we made up. But we're just going to use them first to kind of store where we want it to go. So camera X, we want it to be set to the target's X position, right? So the target.x, so we're setting it to the target's one, which is the ship. And the same for the Y. Alright, so that is the camera X and Y set. But of course, this doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't actually move the camera. For that, we need a function. And there isn't an action block for this, for moving the camera, but there is a function block that we can use to access a function called camera set view pause. And you can see a few other camera functions popping up, but this is the one we want. And you can see it requires 3 inputs or arguments, so the camera and the X and Y position. So we already know the X and Y position, we just set it up here. And the camera, we also need to set. So we can put that in and get rid of these. So the camera that we want is called view camera 0. This is just how we refer to the cameras. The 0 is the one that it uses by default. And now we just need to set an X and Y. So camera X and camera Y. So that's basically all we need to do. Let's try and give that a test. So we actually get an error. It's saying that it can't find an instance called OBJ ship. And it's trying to do that right here when it's setting the camera X to the target. And that is because, remember, we have created the camera in the start room, but there's no ship in this room. So when it goes and tries to do this, it can't because the ship doesn't exist. So we need to be checking if the instance exists and only then performing this code. So if we type in exists, we're going to get an action block called if instance exists. Let's drag that in. And we don't actually want to set it to any of these because, again, we want to do this in a general way. If target is not equal to obj ship at the moment, if it's equal to something else, then I can't just put one of these in. So I'm just going to write target, and that will set it to whatever target is equal to. So if target exists, then we can go ahead and do all of this. Let's try that again. So you can see it's kind of working. There's our ship up the top and the camera is moving around the room, but it looks like the camera is anchored to the top left, which it is, of course. That's how cameras work. So we actually need to move the camera over by half its width and height. So we need to subtract its width and its height to move it up. So we can just do that in here. So just subtract camera width over 2 and subtract camera height over 2. And we'll try that again. There we go. So the camera is following the ship now. And if you caught that weird flash that just happened, that's actually because the ship reached the edge of the room and wrapped back around, but we can't really tell because of how the camera is always just following the player exactly. I still want this ship to wrap around the room, but I want the player to actually have a visual indication for when they're reaching the edge. And to do that, I'm going to get the camera to not move if it's hit the edge. And to do that, we're going to clamp the camera's value. So, again, there is a really handy function that you'll probably find that you want to use a lot when you want to set a value and make sure it's between two other values. So the values we want it to be between, of course, is the very left of the room for the x, so 0. So we can actually start to put that in. So we're going to clamp whatever this value is between 0 and then the right side of the room. But remember that the camera is anchored at the top left, so it's actually not right at the right side of the room, because if the top left corner of the camera gets to the right side of the room, it's already gone over it. So we want to just subtract camera width. Right, so that means its right boundary will never get past the boundary of the room. And we can do the same thing for the y. So we're also going to clamp this value between two other values, so 0 and then the room height minus camera height. So let's go ahead and run that again. And make it to the edge of a room, hopefully. There we go. So you can see when we reach the edge, the camera kind of stops and we're more aware that we're about to cross over. All right, cool. So that's our camera setup. One more thing I want to fix up is that we're no longer displaying the lives and the score correctly, and that's because the game object is actually drawing all of this stuff in the game room itself. So at 0, 0 in the game room. So if you actually go to the top left of the game room, you're going to see all of this stuff in there. But that's not what we want. We want it to kind of be overlaid over the top of the game window itself and not be relative to the game room. And there is a way to do this. So instead of using the draw event, there's something called the draw GUI. So we can right click, change event to the draw GUI. And that's exactly what that will do. So the draw GUI is kind of like a separate layer that gets drawn on top of the game, and it isn't relative to the game room. It's relative to the display. So this will kind of work. Let's run the game and have a look. And already we can see something is a little bit weird. All of our text is kind of half the size of what it was before. But if we just hit enter, we can see at least that it is drawing it in the top left like we want, and it's kind of moving with the camera. So it's on top of the display. And the reason it's half the size of what it kind of used to be is because remember, the display is twice the size of the camera. So it's 1000 by 1000. That's the viewport size. And that's also going to be the size of the GUI, or the graphical user interface. But we can resize that to be the same size as the camera. So we can scale it back down to the camera. All we have to do is head back to the camera, and we only need to set this once. Again, there isn't an action block for this, but there is a function. So if we just type in function call, and this one is called display set GUI size. And the width and height that we want, like I said, is the camera width and height, because at the moment it's at 1000 by 1000. So we need 2 arguments, and the first one is camera width and camera height. So that is going to fix that for us. Let's give it another run. There we go. So everything is the correct size. All right, so that is a good bit of the camera setup. We're going to leave it here for this tutorial, and in the next one, we're going to adjust how our objects are spawning, because as you can see, they're kind of spawning at the edges of the room. Instead, we're going to get them to spawn around the edges of the camera. And we're going to do that by making a script where we can actually pass in any object and get any object to spawn around the camera. So we'll be doing that for the enemies later on as well. So take care, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.